All right. What was the importance of Lincoln's second inaugural address? Okay. And that's something like when you think about like the Civil War, okay, it's a very complicated phenomenon here. And for Lincoln, for me, I think that the second inaugural address really represents like the end of Lincoln's like metamorphosis, okay? Because remember that in 1861, Lincoln was going to war purely to preserve the Union, and that's what he said. He said it all the way through through September of 1862 that Lincoln had no other aims except to preserve the Union. Even when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he still introduced it as a necessary war measure. Okay, so the only reason that the Union Army is liberating slaves is because at that time it really looked like the Confederates would achieve their goal of independence, or at least had a good chance of doing so. And so Lincoln thought he needed to turn up the heat. And of course, he didn't need to tick people off in the border states. And so he said in an open letter about exactly a month before the Emancipation Proclamation, that he was only in this war to preserve the Union. That if he could free none of the slaves and preserve the Union, he'd do that. If he could free all of the slaves and preserve the Union, he'd do that. If he could free some of the slaves and not free some of the slaves and preserve the Union, he would do that. And so that's, as far as that goes, the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it's drafted as a necessary war measure, it does introduce an anti-slavery measure into the North's cause. Okay, so as far as that goes, Lincoln is starting to complete, some sort of, he's evolving, as all good politicians do. And so then when you look at the Gettysburg Address, where he talks about government of the people, for the people, by the people, Lincoln has been going through this process of bringing more meaning to a war that was at first, at least for him, a very limited war against secession and to preserve the Union. So when you look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, it's basically saying that, he has no intention of interfering with slavery, and he doesn't even oppose attempts to enshrine slavery into the Constitution, that he would enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and all of that kind of stuff. So you go to the second inaugural address, and that's when Lincoln says, that if every drop of blood has been drawn with a lash needs to be compensated by another that is drawn with the sword, then so be it. Okay, that he framed this as that this war, that the reason why this war happened. Okay, he sees this in a very like providential, kind of fatalistic kind of light. He believes that God has appointed the time to get rid of human slavery in the United States. And so that really, to me, the second inaugural address really crystallizes Lincoln's evolution from I'm just doing this to preserve the Union to I'm doing this to preserve the Union and to eradicate slavery. Now, another thing about Lincoln's second inaugural address is that although he says that he's like, look, we're going to fight this till the bitter end and we're going to get rid of slavery. He also says that with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us finish the work we are in to bind up the nation's wounds and to create a just and lasting peace. And so that's the other side of this, is that Lincoln, while he's promising to, see the war through, he's promising to end slavery, he's also saying that once this war is over, that Lincoln intends he intends to bring the South back into the Union. He doesn't intend to try to, punish the South or anything like that, that he wants to restore the Union as much as he can without slavery. And of course, this is kind of foreshadowing presidential Reconstruction, which was really already in progress during the war. And so that's the other side of it. So I would say, first of all, that Lincoln is, framing the war as a war to end slavery. And second of all, he is hinting at a lenient Reconstruction when the South surrenders, which was pretty much like almost just a formality by that time. Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia about a month after this. So those are the two things that I would take away from Lincoln's second inaugural address. And so as far as that goes, let's see. John, this question is lacking in specificity. I think you can edit your question. So if you could go ahead and edit that question so that it asks something more specific, that would be excellent. Okay. And so as far as that goes, who were the radical Republicans briefly? Okay. Now, the easiest way for me to explain this is to kind of think about, if you look at politics today, that President Donald Trump is a Republican. And most Republicans have a high opinion of President Trump, but there are some Republicans who do not. In 2016, you had the Never Trump movement. There are some people who are in the Republican Party that are not part of President Trump's faction. In a two-party system, now, if we had a multi-party system, you've got a party for each group of people. In a multi-party system, our Republican Party in the United States would probably be divided into at least 4 smaller parties, okay? That you would have a more libertarian party, you would have a more religious and social conservative party, you would have a party that's more nationalist and concerned about immigration, and then possibly a more centrist party, which would probably include, if we had a multi-party system, people who are today independents and Democrats. So I could see at least 4 parties being formed from the present day Republican Party if we had a multi-party system. And so in every party, it's kind of like a quilt. It's a patchwork of all of these different factions. And so Lincoln was really, one thing that needs to be understood about Lincoln is Lincoln was really kind of I would say a moderate to conservative figure. It's it's actually very, it's not a stretch to say that Abraham Lincoln was a conservative. Okay. Now, if you would say moderate, whatever works here, but Lincoln did not seek to make great changes in things. Okay. So when Lincoln said that we're going to get rid of slavery, the 10% plan and all of that kind of stuff he throws out there, that he told the Southern states, if you want to get back into the Union, then accept emancipation, that you are going to draft a constitution that doesn't have slavery. And then, 10% of the people who voted in 1860 swear an oath to the Union, and there you go. That's Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. Now, he didn't put any stipulations on what happened after that as far as African Americans. And remember, if we think about Dred Scott, the Dred Scott decision said that people of African descent cannot be citizens of the United States. Now, they had absolutely no constitutional background to do that, basis to do that, but that's what the Supreme Court decided. So when the Southern states accepted emancipation, they weren't conferring citizenship on African Americans. And so as far as that goes, there were people in Lincoln's party that felt that Lincoln was being too lenient, that he was too moderate in his approach. And so the radical Republicans, this was the anti-Lincoln wing of the Republican Party that had some bigger goals in mind. What they believed was they wanted to see not only slavery abolished, but they also wanted to see voting rights for African Americans and full citizenship for the African American population. Now, this was something that Lincoln never showed a willingness to do. In his final speech that he ever gave, I believe the day before he was assassinated, Lincoln said that he was certainly open personally. Okay, Lincoln speaking personally, he was saying that he was fine with, he wanted to see perhaps the veterans, the Black veterans, and what he called some of the more intelligent among the Black population get the right to vote. But he never spoke in favor of universal suffrage for African Americans. Now, so the radical Republicans wanted to see they wanted to see this. They wanted to see equality under the law for even the freedmen and women. And so as far as that goes, these were the radicals that they didn't believe in Lincoln's simple war to preserve the Union. They wanted and just abolish slavery. They wanted to see a social revolution in the South that was presided over by the federal government. And so you can see that in Lincoln's Reconstruction policies, which were more lenient, versus the radical Republicans who wanted more punitive measures to be taken against the former Confederate states. So just think about these people as the anti-Lincoln wing of the Republican Party. Now, to underscore this, now, the point of view of this cartoon is Harper's Weekly, which was a Republican publication, but it was not a radical publication, okay? So this was really like a Lincoln Republican, like moderate to conservative Republican publication. In 1864, the radical Republicans actually ran a candidate against Abraham Lincoln. They ran John C. Fremont versus Abraham Lincoln. John C. Fremont had been the Republican nominee in 1856, and he was seen as being too cozy with the abolitionists. There's another cartoon in 1856 that had John C. Fremont stuck in the abolition bog. And so that was the whole thing with Lincoln. The Republicans nominated Lincoln in 1860 because this was somebody who could relate to regular people and was not on the far end of the spectrum of Republicans. Now, here is the Harper's Weekly cartoon, and we see Lady Liberty going to the doctor, and here is John C. Fremont. Now, notice that he is holding this little black baby doll. Okay, now this is not a Southern cartoon. This is not a Northern Democratic cartoon. This is a Northern Republican cartoon. And so we see here where Lincoln has put a bump on his head. Okay, Lincoln's put a bump on his head, and he's clutching this little black doll because he is this is showing how the radical Republicans wanting to run Fremont against Lincoln, that they're really just concerned with African Americans. They're not concerned with preserving the Union, which was the goal of the Lincoln faction: preserve the Union, emancipate. And so they called these people, Lincoln's faction of the Republican Party called these people soreheads. All right, that they are they're soreheads. They're people who aren't going on along with the rest of the party. And meanwhile, Lincoln, of course, and this is what's going to lead to to some of the fights in Reconstruction, that you've really got this kind of when you go through like the moderate Republicans to the radical Republicans, and the Democrats in 1864 were divided between peace Democrats and war Democrats. So the peace Democrats, these are people who were like, go ahead and make peace with the South, see if we can return things to how they were before the war. Now, war Democrats, they wanted to win the war and preserve the Union, really without any regard to slavery. Now, Lincoln is thinking like preserve the Union and abolish slavery. Okay, so this is really like Lincoln would add that. But the radical Republicans, they are adding political equality for Black Americans. And so what Lincoln did in 1864 is he picked a war Democrat, Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, as his running mate. And so what he called this was the Union Party instead of the Republican Party. Now, the radicals eventually dropped their bid. They eventually dropped their bid to run against Lincoln and supported his candidacy, but they didn't approve of Lincoln's more limited approach: win the war, preserve the Union, abolish slavery. And so that really kind of goes into the difference between the Lincoln faction of the Republican Party and the radical Republicans. And so with that being answered, I think it would be good to go ahead and segue here. All right, to go ahead and segue here into let's see. So what we see here is during Reconstruction, what is the difference between the radical Republicans and the Congressional radicals? Okay, that's actually, I thought you were going to ask the difference between Lincoln Republicans and radical Republicans. This is basically the same thing. Okay, if we're going to look at Reconstruction, on one side, we've got presidential Reconstruction. All right, let me go ahead and pull that up just so I can show you a let me go in here so I can show you a graphic to go with this. Okay, so presidential Reconstruction versus radical Reconstruction, but radical Reconstruction is synonymous with Congressional Reconstruction. Okay, so Lincoln's Reconstruction. Now, presidential Reconstruction was about allowing the president to manage Reconstruction policy and to do this as he saw fit. And so the president, whether it be Lincoln or Andrew Johnson, believed that the president should dictate Reconstruction policy, and that Reconstruction policy should be focused on preserving the Union first and foremost. So Congressional Reconstruction, aka Radical Reconstruction. Now, the Radical Republicans, they gained a lot of power and influence after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Had Abraham Lincoln lived, that would be an interesting alternate history kind of scenario, because Lincoln was wanting to focus on this original goal. Like after the war was over and the 13th Amendment was on its way to passage, Lincoln was much more concerned about preserving the Union. Whereas Congressional Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction is about, about punishing the South or former Confederates and making sure that African Americans have equal rights. And so if I've answered your question, the answer to the question, Zoe, quite literally is that there's no difference, that the radicals in Congress, they're radical Republicans. So then let's see what we've got here. Let's jump back to, okay, so Anisha, that is kind of a broad question. I'll kind of see what I can do about that. I prefer questions that are focusing on something, something specific. But before we do that, let's go, and I'll do that. I can look into that, but it would take a long time just kind of go Reconstruction, like start to finish. But one general thing would be putting presidential Reconstruction versus radical Reconstruction. Now, if we go back to the Civil War, Mary, how did General Lee help with the South's early success? Now, it wasn't necessarily just Robert E. Lee. Now, of course, Robert E. Lee was a very capable military tactician, but he didn't take over the Army of Northern Virginia until 1862. Now, as far as that goes, let's go into just very briefly, I think it might be helpful to look at the Union and Confederate advantages that went into the Civil War. Okay, so let me take a look here. And okay, so as far as this goes, let's go into material advantages. All right, so let's go into the material advantages. And so it's not necessarily just Lee, but the South. Now, if we look at this here, that we see the material advantages, the North, is pretty much dominant there. Okay, so the North's got twice as many people. Now, of course, some of the people in the South are enslaved as well. So as far as the part of the population that's able to fight, the North's got a lot more than the South. Now, the North has just about as much farm acreage. Now, of course, some of the Southern farm acreage is focused on cash crop growing, but the North had more manpower. Also, when we look at manufacturing workers, okay, this is the classic Jefferson versus Hamilton, that, for every manufacturing worker in the Confederacy, the Union had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 times the manufacturing capability. And then the bank capital, how much money is the Union going to be able to borrow to finance the war versus the Confederates before they reach a breaking point? And the Union had 2.5 times as much capital available in banks. Okay, so the North had an advantage in manpower, had an advantage in manufacturing workers, and had an advantage in bank capital. Now, Confederates, had an advantage at least early in the war of military leadership. Now, the thing is that there was a tradition in the South, like in the aristocratic Southern families, it was encouraged for them to go to West Point, to the military academy. In fact, when the Deep South seceded, PGT Beauregard was the commandant at West Point. And so he was relieved of that duty as soon as Louisiana seceded. But the South had a lot more, per capita military veterans and just some of the best military minds and leaders. Now, later on, you're going to see that, Sherman and Grant and other Union generals are going to be instrumental in bringing an end to the war. But as far as that goes, certainly the South had, an advantage in military leadership, home field advantage. They knew the terrain, that they knew where they were fighting and were used to the land. Now, defense is an objective, okay? So whereas the Union had to completely subdue and essentially conquer the Confederacy in order for the war to be over, the South just had to essentially repel a Union advance. And so that's something that, is certainly an advantage, that all they've got to do is exhaust the will of the Northern population to support the war, kind of synonymous with what you see like the Viet Cong doing in Vietnam. And the United States had so much more, as far as material resources, manpower, money, but the population, like in Vietnam, the American population lost the will to fight the war, that they no longer supported the war. And in a democracy, that's kind of critical, that the population supports a war. High stakes, that the Confederacy, if the Confederacy loses the war, then they're done. They have to surrender and accept whatever terms the Union gives them. Whereas if the Union just stop fighting the war, then nothing really changes there, except that the Confederacy is independent. And so now the thing is that the Union, at first, they're preserving the Union, and the Confederacy is trying to maintain its status as an independent, as its own country, independent of the United States. Now, the thing is, and this is what you see happen through the Civil War, is that the Union, they were going to benefit from a long war, that the longer this war lasted, the more of an advantage it was to the Union. So if you ask yourself, like, why did Robert E. Lee risk Pickett's charge at Gettysburg? That seems really stupid, right? And in hindsight, it certainly does. But Robert E. Lee felt like Gettysburg was his opportunity to bring the Union to the peace table. And so, knowing that there was really no chance of the Confederacy winning a long war, he tried to bring it to a close there, because the Confederacy really counted on a short war in order for them to achieve their objectives. And so as far as that goes, that's really kind of something that, while kind of indirectly answering your question there and looking at the early successes of the Confederacy, that's certainly something that. Now, the other thing, there was an interesting article I read in some military history magazine. I can't remember where I found it, but a Confederate soldier was more likely to have fired a rifle before entering the service than a Union soldier, many of who had never fired a rifle before, because a lot of them lived in cities. The Union was urbanizing, whereas the Confederacy was still much more rural. And so as far as that goes, let's see what we've got here. All right, so the Anaconda plan. All right, so the Anaconda plan, Jeremy, that kind of goes right into what I was just saying, that the South needed to have a short war, that if this war lasted 3 or more years, the chances of the Confederacy winning and maintaining itself as an independent government was going to be almost nothing. Okay, so the Anaconda plan. Now, this certainly wasn't popular. It wasn't what Northern politicians wanted to hear, but General Winfield Scott came up with the not what he called it, but this is what people, this is on the very next slide from what I was just explaining. So the Anaconda plan was the strategy, really, that the North ended up following. Okay, so when we look here at what they call, what this cartoon is calling Scott's Great Snake, it shows you the goals of the Anaconda plan. One is a naval blockade of southern ports. 2, capture Richmond. Okay, so capture the Confederate capital, which is only about 100 miles from Washington, D.C. Really not that far. It's right there. So go get that. So capture the Confederate capital. Now, the other thing is that Richmond also held a lot of the Confederates' industrial capacity. If Richmond falls, it's not just a matter of the political capital, but also that it was a major manufacturing center for the Confederacy. And then three, control the Mississippi River, because this was certainly a problem for the Union at the outset. And one of the reasons why it was critical that the Confederacy be brought back into the Union from the perspective of Northern politicians is because the economy of these Western states, now railroads were coming into being, but they weren't really established at that time. And so river transportation was still a major source of transportation. And so control the Mississippi River. Now what this does is not only restores northern commerce, but also separates Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the Union, where Texas actually had a good bit of the, of course, you got this cattle in Texas. So a lot of the Confederate Army's food supply was coming from Texas. So a naval blockade of southern ports, capturing Richmond, and then controlling the Mississippi River in order to split the Confederacy, these trans-Mississippi Confederate states from the rest of it. And excuse me, essentially that ends up being exactly the strategy that the Union followed. Now, the thing about the Anaconda Plan is the reason why some Northern politicians didn't like it is because it was a long war plan. It's not just like, hey, go in there. Remember, Lincoln initially, he called for 75,000 troops to enlist for 90 days. Like, Lincoln was looking for a very short war to happen, and that's not what ended up happening. Okay. And so why did American focus shift from Reconstruction to conquest of the West? Okay. Now, Zoe, one thing about Reconstruction, okay, is that after some time, it lost Northern support. It's not just a matter of Southern whites, not liking radical Reconstruction and resisting it, but it was a matter of Northerners just not really caring about. I mean, the radical Republicans had this idea that we're going to stay down there and we're going to keep this thing going until there is political equality and full citizenship for African Americans. Now, a lot of times, it's easy for us to think, okay, well, the Confederates were racist. Okay, given. All right. But what is not quite so obvious and what people don't read is, most classrooms, the primary sources that are looked at may emphasize the racism of Confederates, but then northern whites were quite racist as well. Now, when you get to the 1920s, you'll find out that the epicenter of the second Ku Klux Klan was actually in the Midwest, in like Indiana and states surrounding that. And so, as far as that goes, that Reconstruction is kind of waning on its own. I don't think that it's just a matter of focus shifting, but it even goes back to during the Civil War. Okay, that remember that during the second party system, okay, before the Civil War, the Democratic Party was the dominant party. And after the Civil War, the Republican Party was the dominant party for some time, at least in the presidency. And so in 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act. And so they passed what was basically a very large internal improvement project, which would have, Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay would have loved this. All right. So this very large internal improvement plan that was saying that let's build a railroad. So now during the war, certainly there's not a whole lot being built on that Transcontinental Railroad because a lot of the financial efforts and manpower efforts are going to the war. But after the Civil War is fought, Congress has already passed the Pacific Railway Act, legislating a transcontinental railroad. And so with that, after the war, that becomes a focus. So during Reconstruction, that is happening. So, if we look at, Promontory Point, I believe this was 1869. I'm just making sure that is, that's accurate. Okay, so let's see that Golden Spike. Promontory Point. Okay. Yes, that was in, it looks like, let's see, Promontory Point, 1869. Okay. So the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, and they had this big ceremony in Utah where, let me show you this. It looks like they've actually still got it. Okay. So at this ceremony, at the ceremony, they have driven this golden spike. Let's see, yeah. So that's the original golden spike at the museum at Stanford University, which is of course named for Leland Stanford, who was an official, the person in charge of the Central Pacific Railroad. So 1869, you see that this railroad has been finished, and once the Transcontinental Railroad is finished, then the settlement of the West becomes a big priority. Now, also during the Civil War was the Morrill Land Grant Act. Okay, so the Morrill Land Grant Act was also passed during the Civil War, which is, creating these land grant colleges and universities. And part of this was to kind of encourage, the mechanical arts, agriculture, all that kind of stuff. And then the Homestead Act is the third piece of legislation that could be useful on your exam. There was actually an LEQ a couple years ago about basically the economic consequences of the Civil War. And so the Homestead Act was also passed during the Civil War. And this is giving like literally free soil. Like we think about free soil, we think about people just not wanting slavery in the West, but it is also a matter of wanting white settlers to go out there and settle in the West. Now, of course, there were the exodusters. There were some black settlers that actually settled in Kansas as well. And so as far as that goes, that Congress had already laid the foundation. The Republican Congress during the Civil War had already made the orderly settlement of the West and the development of a market that's connecting California to the rest of the country. That's already happening. So these things are really going on at the same time, even though when we take this as an academic course, we look at one thing and then another, but really it's kind of like, one's going up while the other's going down. And, they're not strictly speaking related phenomena. Okay, so when was the Freedmen's Bureau created and how was it killed? Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau was created you're very welcome, Zoe. The Freedmen's Bureau was created by the Republican Congress after the Civil War, and the purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to help these freedmen and women with their problems after the Civil War, okay, because there were race riots in some southern cities. There were also some free people that had been separated from their families, whether by war or perhaps being sold, somewhere else. And so, they were trying to reunite families. They were also trying to find work for freedmen and women. Now, finding work is it's not like they're finding them skilled jobs. They're basically like, okay, well, here's a place where you can go be a sharecropper. Somebody's looking for a farmhand. So here's some work for you. And also to provide educational opportunities. So the Freedmen's Bureau was was basically designed to help, the freedmen and women adjust to their new life, which, as you know from studying Reconstruction, really wasn't that different from the old one because of these sharecropping arrangements. There was never there were some radical Republicans that wanted to redistribute a redistribution of land, that they wanted land to be taken from Confederate supporters and given to these freedmen and women, but that didn't end up happening. And so the Freedmen's Bureau existed for that, and it really didn't have a lot of support in the Northern electorate because, as we were saying, when you talk about the Civil War, like what was it about? Was it about this? Was it about that? It's complicated. And so it's not like the North won the war and the Northern population is like, yeah, let's make sure that that Black people in the South are getting a good deal and they're getting citizenship rights. Not so much. And so it really lost popular support and just kind of expired. Let me check the year on that. The exact year. I also know that the Freedmen's Bureau never really had a lot of support from President Johnson. Okay, President Johnson was never a fan of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so as far as that, so it was created in March of 1865. And let's see, it ended, let's see, so that was, the article's not making it very, okay, let's see. Yeah, I'm not seeing that, but sometime during Reconstruction, it was um, okay, 1872. All right, so they refused to approve renewal authorizing legislation. Okay, so what happened was basically in 1872, Congress said that we are not going to. We're not going to go along with it. So let me see, House of Representatives election 1868. Okay, let me just take a look here. That what you're going to see here, or wait, 1870, because it's 1872. So if we go to 1870, okay, the Republicans are still in charge, but remember, so let me just show you here that the Democrats, okay, so let's go ahead and just take a look at what's happening with President Andrew Johnson, just to kind of show you what's happening. And so if we go back to 1866, which is this is the election after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans gained 38 seats in Congress, 175 to 47. So when Congress is going back and forth between now let's see, why is that to 8? Okay, so there's a note here. Okay, excluded states readmitted after the start of the Congress. Okay, so the thing is, what you're seeing here is the Republicans really had, like, there were 3 Republicans for every Democrat, more than 3. Now, 1868, what we'll see here is the Democrats gained 20 seats. Now, there are still almost 3 Republicans for every Democrat. So we go to 1870, and we see here there are now 100 so now there are 104 to 139. And so if we look at this note here, that you've got. Okay, and then so this note here, this includes a liberal Republican, an independent Republican, but the radical Republicans, even though the Republicans hold the majority, the radicals by this time are really out of power, and it's really going to get to the point where I believe it's the 1872 election. Okay, not quite. Okay, you actually got the Republicans got some wins there, but finally, where we go to, so by 1874 was where you see that the Democrats, like, whoa, like they gained a whole bunch of seats there. And so by the time, and of course, Reconstruction ends in 1877. And so at this point, it's really, you can kind of see the way that trend's going, that the support for Reconstruction, especially radical Reconstruction, is going steadily down as Reconstruction's going. And so the Freedmen's Bureau is killed when radical Reconstruction on behalf of African Americans is losing steam and losing support in the North. Okay. So as far as that goes, let's see, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Okay, so the 13th Amendment. Now, I always ask people, like when I'm teaching a class, I ask, what did the 13th Amendment do? And they say abolish slavery. And I ask, what else did the 13th Amendment do? And they're all thinking about it. They're like, huh? And they're just like racking their brains. And then I reveal to them it's a trick question, because it did nothing. Okay, that it freed slaves. Now, of course, then Kanye was talking about the 13th Amendment and how it does, it basically exempts criminals from its provisions. Like, it makes clear that convicted criminals who were in jail, like prisoners, can still be made to do slave labor according to the Constitution. But basically, as far as the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery. Now, the thing is that slavery is abolished, but it's almost like if your parents were to kick you out of the house and with no money. So, and I'm not talking about you're going to college. I'm talking about, like, some of y'all, most of y'all are probably in 11th grade, maybe some of you in 10th grade. And so imagine that your parents, who have had like all these rules for you, and you're like, I hate these rules. But then again, you stay under their roof because they provide things for you. But let's say that they kick you out of the house and you're like, oh, I'm free. But then you're like, I don't have any money. I don't have any job skills. All I can really do is go work for minimum wage at a fast food restaurant or grocery store or something like that. And you realize that, like, whoa, this freedom, like, I'm not really not really ready for this. Okay, that there's not, as far as economically, you're not equipped. And so the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it really didn't do anything to protect African Americans from, the governments of the southern states during Reconstruction, which passed black codes. Okay, so this is where we have to think about the black codes. They basically defined citizenship as applying only to whites, and that while slavery was abolished, that freedmen and women did not have the same rights as white citizens of those states. That would include the right to bear arms. That a black man was declared ineligible to have a gun or even a Bowie knife, like a knife that can do some damage. That was in the Mississippi Black Code. Even a black man owning a Bowie knife was deemed illegal. That black residents, because they're not being defined as citizens, they couldn't purchase alcoholic beverages. They were not allowed to be intoxicated. If a minister wanted to preach, they had to get a license from the state. Now, remember, before the 14th Amendment, states could pass about any regulation that they wanted. And so as far as that goes, the 13th Amendment did not confer citizenship or rights on African Americans. That's what the 14th Amendment did. Okay, so the 14th Amendment abolished, or 14th Amendment not abolished, but instituted birthright citizenship, that anybody who is born in the United States and subject to its laws is a citizen of the United States, making clear that African Americans are citizens of the United States and are entitled to all of the privileges and immunities of citizenship, as well as due process. And so as far as that goes, that's the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment still did not confer the right to vote, okay? Because remember, technically, a woman at that time was a citizen of the country, but not a citizen in the sake, like in the real sense, that, she could actually participate in politics and in the governing process. Now, the 15th Amendment was very clever. It didn't say that people who are, of African descent cannot vote. Must be allowed to vote. It didn't say they must be allowed to vote. It said that someone cannot be disallowed to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so the thing is, it didn't say that somebody could be told you can't vote because you can't read. And so as far as that goes, you see that what happens after Reconstruction is over, that you see with the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. So all citizens are to be treated equally. Well, Plessy versus Ferguson, you saw where you had the railroad cars that, were segregated. And so Homer Plessy sued and said that this isn't right. The 14th Amendment says that there's equal protection of laws. Well, the Supreme Court issued the separate but equal doctrine. So if you think about it, if we order two pizzas and I've got a medium pepperoni pizza and you've got a medium pepperoni pizza, then we've both got a medium pepperoni pizza. And so the Supreme Court said that that does not violate the 14th Amendment, as long as there are, cars that, like if there's a car that anybody can get into, then it doesn't violate the Constitution. Now, if there were an all-white train, then that would violate the Constitution. Now, the thing is that these facilities for Black Americans, those were not on the same level. But it was the Supreme Court was just basically saying after Reconstruction that we're not going to interfere with this, with this Jim Crow system in the South. Now, another part of the Jim Crow system was, of course, literacy test, but also a grandfather clause, okay? Whereas if your grandfather had been able to vote in the 1860 election, then you're good. Like, you can vote without a literacy test. And we still use this term today. It's called being grandfathered in, where people who are already part of an organization before a certain point might be exempt from certain new requirements. So you might hear that term grandfathered in. So that was, in 1860, if somebody's somebody's grandfather could vote in that election, then they could say, well, I'm exempt from the literacy test. And so what they did, they used the grandfather clause to go around the 15th Amendment's prohibition of not allowing people to vote because of race, color, and previous condition of servitude. So as far as that goes, that's what you're looking at there, that in the wake of Reconstruction, these amendments did not, because of the way that the government dealt with them and the Supreme Court interpreted them, these did not, go a long way in helping African Americans during the Jim Crow era. In fact, what they call the nadir, the low point of American race relations, was the turn of the 20th century. And so with that, now, Annie, women in the Civil War has never really been like a topic that I've seen come up, but certainly the role of African Americans in the Civil War is something that would be. I've seen a DBQ on the role of African Americans in the Civil War, and so looking at that, let's see what we've got here. Okay, so first of all, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed the Union to enlist African Americans in the Army. And so as far as that goes, about 180,000 African Americans enlisted in the Union Army in the later years of the war. That was 10% of the Union Army, whereas African Americans only made up about 1% of the Northern population. So about a tenth of those who enlisted in the Union Army were African Americans, and they volunteered for these jobs. Okay, and so what we really need to know here, a few things that would be good for your DBQ, LEQ. First of all, as I said, all volunteer, that the only people who were drafted were white. So all of these people volunteered. Now, they were placed in segregated units led by white officers. During the Civil War, there were no black men who were given the rank of commissioned officers. Now, certainly, somebody could be like a sergeant or something like that. But if you look here is a picture of United States soldiers at Camp William Penn in Philadelphia. And so you see that the unit is black and they are led by a white officer. Now, as far as something specific, if you've ever seen the movie Glory, or even if you have not, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. This was one of the first African-American units to see combat during the Civil War. And so that takes these people through it looks at the lives of these people through, from the Emancipation Proclamation and the initial enlistment of African Americans to the attack on Fort Wagner in the Charleston Harbor. And so there is a painting here of the assault on Fort Wagner, which the 54th Massachusetts played a prominent role in that assault. Now, African Americans, as far as the Confederates, that basically, although Robert E. Lee advocated, that it would be militarily smart to, allow for the enlistment of African Americans, it was really too little too late. In March, the Confederate Congress finally passed a piece of legislation that was really weak. It didn't even give unconditional emancipation to people who enlisted, but it did allow for the formation of units. But this was right before the end of the war, and that was pretty much like, they kind of missed the boat on that. So while you may be able to find like isolated incidents of, there may have been, in Louisiana, there was actually a militia unit of free people of color, but they weren't part of the actual Confederate Army. So those are some things to think about as far as African Americans in the Civil War. All right, so thank you, Annie, for that question. Okay, so as far as that goes, Hiram, the international support. Okay, so the thing is, part of Lincoln's aim for the Emancipation Proclamation was to make it impossible for Britain and France to support the Confederacy. So before the Emancipation Proclamation, the Confederates had ambassadors, or at least like envoys, because you can't have an ambassador because they were, the Confederates were they were an unrecognized state. Like Britain and France never recognized the Confederacy. Okay, so it's kind of like during the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin was a representative of the colonies in the French court, but they had belligerent status. Okay, so belligerent status means that you have not been recognized, your government's not been formally recognized, but you are allowed to at least have somebody there to make your case. Okay, so the Confederates had they had these envoys at the French and British courts communicating with the government. But what happened, like the British had abolished slavery and the slave trade and all that, I think in the 1840s. And so, and the British are actually, they're more people are voting than used to. So although the Confederates had a lot of support from the more established and wealthier people in Britain, they didn't have popular support because, as far as in Britain, it became, it's like, well, we can't recognize this, the population isn't going to really put up with recognizing the Confederacy, which after the Emancipation Proclamation was seen as fighting for slavery. And so that never happened. I think that Lincoln, it was a very, very adept move on Lincoln's part to put out the Emancipation Proclamation, because it really put an end to efforts by, as far as the chances of success for the Confederates to be recognized were pretty much like done after that. And then also, I believe that the British were also finding new sources of cotton. Like you can grow cotton in India, for example. So the Confederates were not as like necessary after that. So, good question there. All right. And so as far as that goes, now, Zoe, I would not get into a difference between the 10% plan and Andrew Johnson's plan. What I would focus on is that Johnson tried to continue Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, which the thing for that, when you look at Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, preserve the Union, allow the Southern states back into Congress, no, military occupation or anything like that. Just a lenient Reconstruction plan that focused on emancipation and preserving the Union, whereas the radical Republicans were more focused on, punishing former Confederates and making sure that African Americans had citizenship rights. So I don't see any case where you would really have to know how was Johnson's plan, like the intricacies and the differences there. What you really need to focus on is the difference between presidential Reconstruction, directed by the president, lenient, focused on emancipation, preserving the Union, letting the Southern states back into the Union, and then radical Reconstruction, which said that the Southern states, they seceded, they're gone, move your feet, lose your seat. They treated them like conquered provinces to be occupied by the military, which would enforce voting rights for African Americans. And so, I would not focus on that question for APUSH. Let's see. Okay, John, that is a very, very complex sort of question there. Now, Chris, why did sharecropping emerge? How did it affect freed people in the Southern economy? Now, sharecropping is really, that's something that had been around. Okay, like it'd been around a while, that you give the person who owns the land a share of the crop. And so part of that is, although there were some people who promised freed men 40 acres and a mule, it never happened. Okay, so remember, there was never any kind of land distribution. So these slaves who were freed had no property. They had to work someone else's land. And if you do that, you either work that as a tenant farmer, which is a farmer that that pays rent. Okay, so you're either paying rent or you're giving a share of the crop. Now, not a share of the crop that actually grew, but a share of the crop that was supposed to grow. So if you had like a bad year, then you're in debt. Okay, so as far as that goes, sharecropping was a way to it was pretty much a continuation of the Southern cotton economy as it had been before, except now, there was no obligation on the part of the landowner to provide food and lodging for the workers, but they were on their own. And so they ran up a lot of debt. So as far as that goes, now, another thing to note is that there were plenty of white sharecroppers, but, it's not like a much lower percentage of white people were sharecroppers than black people. So, sharecropping was not necessarily exclusive to the African American race. So sharecropping emerged just basically to deal with how do we continue the economy and not completely crash the Southern economy, which was still based on cash crop agriculture. I'm certainly glad I can help, Emma. Certainly glad. Okay, so let's see. And I may go, it's 8 o'clock, but I think I'm going to go a little bit longer here and try to answer the questions that have been asked. Okay, so no new questions at this point, but let me kind of go through here and address some of the things here. Now, Jody, that's a great alternate history sort of question. And there's certainly been a lot of historiography there. The Vietnam War was a big, I've mentioned that before in comparing these things, that the Confederates there were, a lot of emphasis is placed on Robert E. Lee's initial success in the Eastern Theater, but the Western Theater was a disaster for the Confederates, from day one. Okay. So for example, P.G.T. Beauregard said, you need to get all of the Confederate troops in the West together. But instead of trying to protect key places, the Confederates had a strategy where the Confederate government wanted to protect all of the territory, and which they couldn't. So there certainly are, when we look at what happened in Vietnam, that the United States had all of these resources and still couldn't win because they lost popular support. The Confederates certainly could have won the Civil War if certain things had gone differently. Now, first of all, when Ulysses S. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson, on the Mississippi River and one of those rivers, but basically Tennessee fell very early. New Orleans fell in 1862. New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederacy and I believe its largest port. And so those were some things that had those gone differently, things might have gone differently there. Now, another thing, of course, Lee's defeat at Gettysburg was certainly something that we look back as a turning point. Now, the same week that Lee lost at Gettysburg, was defeated at Gettysburg, then the city of Vicksburg, which was the last major city on the Mississippi River controlled by the Confederates, that Vicksburg fell as well in July of 1863. So that's a military turning point. The Confederate defeat at Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg, looking back, it's okay, it's going to be hard to recover from that. I think the Emancipation Proclamation was certainly something, because Lincoln redefined the war as an anti-slavery war and got support there. Now, I would say that at what point did the South really lose the Civil War? I would say that when Abraham Lincoln was reelected in 1864, that I think the Confederates, if McClellan, George McClellan was running against Lincoln. If you look at the election of 1864, Lincoln only got 55% of the vote. So Northern public opinion was fairly fragmented there. But the thing is that the Copperhead movement reached its peak in early 1863 at the time of Lee's victory at Chancellorsville. Now, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Copperhead movement, which was, the Peace Democrats, kind of dwindled. But I would say that once Abraham Lincoln was reelected, because that's when he approved Sherman's plan. Now, Sherman submitted his plan for his march and for scorched earth before the election of 1864, but Lincoln thought this is not going to be something that people will tolerate, in the North, even the North, he didn't want, news of this during an election year. So once Lincoln was reelected, it's okay, let's go in here and finish the job. So I would say that, the South, certainly there are scenarios in which the Confederacy could have won the Civil War, which, remember, that's not defeating the North, but just exhausting the North's will to fight. And so they certainly had a chance, but there are a lot of different, Shiloh, for example. That's another one in the West where Grant was it looked like he was going to be defeated on day one, and on day two he was reinforced and counterattacked. And so had the Confederates defeated Grant at Shiloh, that's another thing. So yeah, I mean the South certainly, while they were underdogs, but they had they weren't without victory options. But I think the election of 1864, Lincoln's reelection, is really what sealed the deal. Thank you for your question, Jody. And the regional power struggle during the Civil War, its impact on the U.S. John, that's I'm gonna go ahead and just these two questions are both, and the one about Reconstruction in general, they're just they're not very specific. Rich is asking here the one reason. I don't know if I'd ever give one reason. See, let me close by saying this. This is, to me, the biggest problem with the Civil War. And, that everybody wants like one answer. Like, what was the Civil War about? Okay, so can we say one thing? Was it about slavery or was it not about slavery? And then what was the one reason that the Civil War was won by the North? I think that there are a variety of reasons. Now, if I were to rattle some off, I would say certainly the material advantages did not hurt. Okay, that having more manpower, more money, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, Rich, the thing is, I would say that the material advantages would be one, but I would attribute it to Lincoln's. If I had to say one thing, I would say Lincoln's leadership. Now, that's multifaceted, but Abraham Lincoln, first of all, he knew what needed to be done. He knew what he needed. He knew he needed an aggressive general. When it came across that McClellan was not aggressive enough, he fired him. Other people he fired. And then finally, he found Sherman and Grant. Like, he found the people he needed, and then he let them do their jobs. Also, Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation, and also having the foresight to kind of see that, black enlistment will be good for the Union cause, and the emancipation will strengthen the moral cause of the Union. These are things there. So I would say that Jefferson Davis, his leadership was just not as effective as Abraham Lincoln's. There's actually a book that I bought that I haven't read. I think I've got on my desk here somewhere, that this is basically by I don't think this is by a historian. This is a guy that studies rhetoric, but the book is basically focusing on how Jefferson Davis, this is a War of Words, the rhetorical leadership of Jefferson Davis, that this book is focusing on how essentially Jefferson Davis was never able to use rhetoric in the same way that Lincoln was to rally support for the cause. And so all kinds of things but I would say that Abraham Lincoln's leadership would have been the most important thing there.